He sat behind the wheel of the black Mercedes S-Class, dressed in a tailored black suit with a simple gray tie, clean-shaven with dark sunglasses covering his sharp, calculating eyes. At first glance, he looked like any other high-end chauffeur, professional, reserved and silent. The kind who knew when to speak and when not to, the kind you barely noticed even though he sat just feet away. But what no one could have guessed was that the man holding the steering wheel was worth billions, not figuratively, literally. His name wasn't listed on any of the public rich lists, and he wasn't the face of any media empire or global corporation. In fact, the identity most people associated with that name was a ghost, nearly impossible to track, often dismissed as urban myth among those who whispered about the ultra-wealthy. But there he was, driving clients across the city like it was just another Tuesday. The question wasn't just why he was doing it. The question was how long he had been doing it and what he was looking for. For years, people had speculated about eccentric billionaires and their odd hobbies, collecting rare insects, building bunkers in remote mountains, even adopting new identities just to live among regular people. But this man had taken it a step further. He wasn't just pretending to be someone else. He had built an entire alternate life, one where he clocked in every morning at 6 a.m., greeted his dispatch manager with a nod, and waited for assignments like the rest of the drivers. He'd take clients from the airport to luxury hotels, from boardroom meetings to weekend getaways in the Hamptons, all while listening politely, offering water, and managing perfect silence when needed. He knew the roads like a seasoned pro. He knew the moods of the rich, the arrogance of the newly rich, and the quiet despondence of those pretending they still were. It wasn't always like this for him. There was a time when he was surrounded by people who addressed him as Sir, without a trace of irony or professionalism. They feared him, not because he was cruel, but because his mind was ruthless. In rooms filled with venture capitalists, hedge fund managers, and Silicon Valley icons, he rarely spoke unless necessary. But when he did, people listened. He had started his empire quietly, buying into companies others were too distracted or arrogant to notice. He had an eye for things on the verge of failure, startups with bleeding revenue sheets, family-owned businesses staggering under bad management, legacy brands on the brink of irrelevance. He would swoop in, offer a lifeline with conditions so subtle and layered they'd only understand the true price a year later, and by then he owned everything. By the time he was 45, his net worth was somewhere north of 11 billion, not that it mattered to him anymore. His penthouse apartment remained untouched for weeks. He had homes on 3 continents, none of which he spent more than a few days in each year. The people who knew of him stopped expecting invitations, stopped sending messages. Some assumed he was ill. Others thought he'd gone off to some Himalayan retreat, chasing enlightenment. But no one suspected he'd be parking a sedan outside an investment firm downtown, waiting for a junior partner to finish his late-night meeting. The idea hadn't started as a scheme. It began with boredom. An emptiness that money could not fill and relationships could not distract from. He wanted anonymity, but more than that, he wanted context. He wanted to see the world without the lens of influence. For so long, people had only ever treated him in one of 2 ways, with awe or fear. It created a distortion, a dangerous one. When no one tells you the truth, you begin to forget what the truth sounds like. So he erased himself from the rooms that had once defined him and stepped into a smaller world, one where he could be invisible. Becoming a driver wasn't as hard as it should have been. He had connections, of course, and had a forged identity built with such precision it could pass scrutiny even from the IRS. He trained for months, driving techniques, etiquette, how to blend in. Then, with a new name, he applied to a high-end chauffeur service that catered to elite clientele. He was just another applicant. His references checked out. His criminal background was spotless. His demeanor suggested discipline. They hired him within 2 weeks. The first few months were the most jarring, not because of the work. He had known it would be tedious, but because of the perspective. The backseat held stories he had never imagined. Husbands whispering into phones with voices lowered in guilt. Executives berating assistants until they cried. CEOs discussing firings like they were weather forecasts. The intimacy of that space shocked him. When people believe you're beneath them, they let their guards down in the most revealing ways. He saw ambition without masks, cruelty without filters, vulnerability in its rawest form. And through it all, he kept driving, listening, observing, learning. One rainy afternoon, he picked up a young woman from a hospital in the Bronx. She was exhausted, her clothes wrinkled, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't speak for most of the ride. He could tell she was fighting back tears. As they approached her destination, an apartment in a crumbling building with broken windows, she finally looked up. "Do you ever feel like you're just tired of pretending?" she asked, not expecting an answer. He didn't respond, but the question stayed with him. Moments like that began to accumulate. The veneer he had built to keep himself apart started to crack, but not in the way he expected. He began to care, not just about the people, but about the patterns, about how the world really worked when it wasn't filtered through luxury and power. He noticed how often people lied, not just to others, but to themselves. He noticed how fear shaped decisions more than greed did. He noticed how loneliness showed up in 1,000 different forms. And in all that, he started to feel something close to purpose. He wasn't just driving anymore. He was mapping the emotional landscape of a city. Each route told him something new. He learned to distinguish between the different types of silence, a resignation, a stewing anger, a deep sadness. He saw breakups happen through tense conversations. He witnessed reconciliations through quiet hand-holding. He was present for the most pivotal moments of people's lives, always pretending he didn't hear or feel anything, but it wasn't just about the human connection. Part of him remained the strategist, the empire builder. He began to see opportunities where others saw despair. The logistics company whose CEO was clearly embezzling, the venture firm bleeding talent and morale, the chain of wellness spas losing customers due to mismanagement. With each ride, he filed away insights, not to act on immediately, but to build a new portfolio, one rooted in something far more personal. One evening, while driving a retired real estate mogul back from a gala, he was recognized, not by name, but by something deeper. The man peered at him through the rearview mirror. "You remind me of someone," he said slowly. "Can't put my finger on it, but there's something in your eyes, like you've seen everything twice." The billionaire driver didn't flinch. "Maybe I just listen better than most," he replied. The mogul chuckled. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe you're just playing the long game." The truth was, he didn't know if it was a game anymore. At first, the deception had been a means to an end, but over time, it became its own form of truth. He had learned more about himself behind that wheel than he ever did in boardrooms. He saw who he became when no one expected anything from him. When he had no control over others, no leverage, when the only currency he had was attention, there was a temptation to reveal himself, to pull off the mask and watch people's expressions shift from indifference to shock. But he never gave in, because the moment they knew, the truth would vanish. They'd stop being real. They'd change their behavior, their tone, their words, and the mirror he had built would shatter, so he kept driving, through rain and sun, through traffic and silence, through neighborhoods where his name meant nothing and streets where he once closed million-dollar deals. He wasn't sure how long he would do it, maybe until it stopped teaching him something. Maybe until the loneliness returned, or maybe forever. He often thought about the systems we live in, the ones we inherit, the ones we build, the ones we run from. He had conquered one. Now he was quietly moving through another. He understood now that power was not just about ownership or influence. It was about perception. And the most powerful thing in the world was to control your own narrative, even if it meant giving up everything others envied you for. And so the billionaire, pretending to be a driver, continued to live between the lines, where anonymity met purpose, where silence told stories, and where the question wasn't just why he did it, but whether we'd do the same if we had the chance. There was a rhythm to the days now. Wake before sunrise, shower in silence, choose from one of the 4 identical suits hanging in his modest closet, tie the knot just so, polish the shoes, and walk down the 3 flights of stairs of his rented walk-up apartment in Queens. No doorman, no concierge, no elevator. Just the creak of old steps and the slight echo of city life already beginning to hum outside. He kept the apartment sparsely furnished, clean, efficient, nothing sentimental. The only hint of personal touch was a single black and white photograph by the window, a blurred shot of a highway at dusk. headlights stretched into streams of white like ghosts heading somewhere fast. Every morning, he sat in the driver's seat 10 minutes early. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. The silence before the dispatch messages came in had become sacred. It reminded him that this was real, that he was still choosing to do this, that he wasn't trapped in some elaborate punishment or psychological breakdown. His mind was sharp. Maybe sharper than it had ever been. But there was something more compelling in this strange double life he had created, something addictive in its ambiguity. When the radio finally crackled to life with the day's first assignment, it always gave him a small jolt of anticipation. The passengers rotated in and out, faces blurring together like scenes from a long movie. He rarely asked questions, but he learned everything by watching. The older woman with a perfume-scented scarf and a stack of legal documents she flipped through nervously. The tech startup duo in their 20s, high-fiving 1 minute and then arguing about equity splits the next. The theater producer who made passive-aggressive calls to underperforming actors in between bites of a kwasa. They never paid him much attention, which suited him perfectly. It wasn't invisibility, exactly, it was access. Access to the unfiltered version of people. And increasingly to the truth about the world he had once ruled from the top. The contradiction was always present. One moment, he'd be adjusting the climate control to a billionaire's preference, someone who didn't know they were sitting just feet away from a man who, years ago, could have bought their company outright. The next moment, he'd be squeezing the car into a tight parking space in the Lower East Side, brushing shoulders with delivery drivers and exhausted nannies, nodding politely but keeping his mouth shut. He'd gone from influencing the global economy to standing in line at a bodega for a black coffee and a banana. But it didn't feel like a fall. It felt like a return. Still, secrets had weight. And though he carried his well, there were moments when the old life tugged at him like a ghost hand brushing his collar. It happened most often when he recognized someone from before. It was bound to occur eventually. The circles of influence were not infinite, and New York was a city of crossings and convergences. One afternoon, he was assigned to drive a corporate attorney named Bennett Strauss to a midtown lunch meeting. Bennett had once represented him in a hostile takeover nearly a decade earlier. He was fatter now, balder, and he barely looked up from his phone. As he settled into the backseat, he barked a destination and went back to texting. The billionaire driver said nothing, keeping his face angled slightly toward the street, but Bennett's voice was unmistakable, sharp, nasal, self-important. He listened as Bennett recounted a recent negotiation where he'd crushed a small founder's dream just to prove a point. The man hadn't changed. Not at all. Halfway through the drive, Bennett paused and looked up. "You knew?" he asked. The driver nodded without turning. "You sound familiar," Bennett muttered, frowning. "You ever do corporate law?" "No, sir." "Huh," he said, eyes narrowing briefly before sliding back to his phone. "Must be my imagination. You got the same calm as someone I used to know. Cold, calculated, but, effective." The driver didn't respond. But for the rest of the ride, he could feel Bennett staring at the back of his head in quick, confused glances. When they arrived at the restaurant, Bennett tipped generously, perhaps a subconscious attempt to placate the memory his mind couldn't quite place. The driver watched him disappear into the revolving doors and then exhaled deeply. Close, but not too close. It wasn't fear that haunted him, it was inevitability. He knew this facade couldn't last forever. People remembered, faces resurfaced, whispers traveled. Eventually, someone would connect the dots. Maybe it would be a journalist, maybe a former board member. Maybe a curious client who found his face just a little too familiar. He wasn't hiding because he was ashamed. He was hiding because he was still building, something quieter this time, something deeper. In the evenings, when his shift ended, he returned to a different kind of work. In his small apartment, he had a setup that would make most day traders weep. 6 monitors, a secure server, and multiple firewalls. Through encrypted channels and under anonymous aliases, he directed capital flows, made surgical investments, and controlled silent partnerships. He still had his hands in the game, only now the pieces moved in darkness. He funded a nonprofit that helped small business owners protect themselves from predatory lenders. He anonymously backed a journalist investigating corruption in a multinational real estate conglomerate. He funneled seed capital into a dozen tiny ventures that others wouldn't touch, and then connected them quietly with the resources they needed to survive. He wasn't trying to be a savior. He knew better than most that idealism without realism was a dead end. But he was designing a new model, one where money wasn't about visibility or dominance, but about direction, influence without spotlight, leverage without intimidation, and he did it all while driving strangers to boardrooms and brunches. One of the few people who knew his secret was a woman named Nia. She was the dispatcher at the chauffeur company, early 30s, sharp-tongued, with an encyclopedic knowledge of city traffic and an uncanny ability to read drivers. She'd taken a liking to him early on, mostly because he never complained, never got into accidents, and always returned the cars cleaner than he found them. Over time, their interactions evolved into something more personal. They didn't talk about the past. She never asked why a man with his bearing and vocabulary would settle for this job. She respected silence in the same way he did. But she noticed things. One night, after a particularly long shift, they ended up grabbing a drink at a dive bar 3 blocks from the office. They sat in a corner booth, nursing beers and talking about the weirdest clients they'd seen that month. At one point, she leaned back and looked at him sideways. "You know," she said, "you've got this vibe." "What kind of vibe?" he asked without smiling. "Like you've been rich. But not just money rich, power rich. Like you used to walk into a room and everyone stopped talking." He tilted his head slightly. "And now you walk in and people barely notice," she said. "But I think that's the way you want it." He didn't answer, but she nodded anyway, thought so. From that night on, there was an unspoken understanding between them. She never dug deeper. He never lied. They became allies of sorts, 2 people navigating the city's undercurrents without needing to explain themselves. Occasionally, she'd slip him certain clients she thought he might find interesting, not for tips, but for stories. And he trusted her enough to listen. The work was changing him. Not breaking him, but bending him in new directions. He no longer craved the deals or the domination. What he craved was meaning, moments of clarity, instances where he could see the world for what it was, not through wealth, but through vulnerability, through contradiction, through truth. One afternoon, he drove a father and son to a cancer center. The boy was 7, thin and pale, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. The father sat silent, one hand resting gently on his son's knee. No words were exchanged for most of the ride, but when they arrived, the boy looked up and said, "Thanks for driving us." "My dad's scared, but he doesn't show it." The father chuckled painfully. "Kids, huh?" The billionaire said nothing, but something cracked inside him. That night, he wired $2 million anonymously to the hospital's pediatric unit, earmarked for research and family housing support. He didn't do it to feel better. He did it because he could, because it mattered, because this version of his life, the driver, the observer, the hidden architect, was finally starting to make sense, but the storm was coming. Somewhere out there, someone was sniffing too close to the truth. An investigative blogger had posted a speculative article about a phantom investor quietly propping up socially conscious ventures with eerie precision. The math was too perfect, the patterns too deliberate. The blogger hadn't made the connection yet, but it was only a matter of time. And when it happened, when the illusion shattered, he knew the decision would come swiftly, disappear again or step into the light and redefine everything. For now, though, he drove, one hand on the wheel, eyes scanning the road, listening to the city breathe. Because even billionaires need to disappear sometimes, not to hide, but to remember who they are when no one is watching. The days blurred as autumn curled into winter. Morning routes now started under skies still dark, streets glazed in frost, headlights trailing like distant comets. The city, usually defiant and chaotic, grew quiet in the early hours. People wrapped themselves in scarves and thicker walls of silence. And still, he drove. Fewer conversations happened in the backseat now, but those that did were heavier: year-end regrets, arguments about money, hushed calls to therapists, or long, slow exhalations of people realizing something they'd kept buried all year. He became a kind of ghost witness, silently ferrying people through their most vulnerable months. And every mile carried him closer to a decision he had been postponing for too long. The article dropped on a Monday morning. Not in the Times or the Journal, but on a digital platform run by a fiercely independent investigative journalist named Rowan Cale. The headline was cryptic: "The billionaire nobody sees tracing the shadow behind the angel capital pattern." Beneath it, a photo of a darkened boardroom, no names. No direct accusations, but the piece was meticulous. It detailed investment paths that led to the same shell companies, nonprofits, and subsidiaries, each one linked by a subtle constellation of timing, structure, and philosophy. It referenced dormant corporations reactivated overnight. It cited anonymous sources from the margins of venture capital who admitted being approached by a silent partner with impossibly deep pockets. Rowan didn't say his name, likely because she didn't know it, but the shape of him was there, drawn with unnerving accuracy. By the time he finished reading the article, he was parked outside a hotel in Soho, waiting for a client who was now 20 minutes late. His hands stayed on the wheel steady, but his mind raced. He wasn't surprised. He had been seen, not fully, but enough. Enough that soon others would begin digging, chasing the threads. Someone would get lucky. Someone would remember a face. He could disappear again. Change cities, build a new cover, wipe the tracks clean. He had the means. But that option, once appealing, now felt like a coward's retreat. He had chosen this life to understand the world again, but what he hadn't realized was that it would also force him to confront his own legacy, what he would leave behind, not in money, but in memory. He decided to reach out to Rowan. He didn't do it directly. That would have been reckless. Instead, he created a digital breadcrumb trail, one she was smart enough to follow encrypted messages leading her to a secure video call. When she finally appeared on the screen, he could see the recognition in her eyes before he spoke a word. She was in her late 30s, sharp and cautious, with that combination of curiosity and skepticism that only true investigative minds possess. "I assume you know why I'm reaching out," he said. She nodded slowly. "You're the ghost," he smiled faintly. "You could say that. You've hidden yourself better than anyone I've ever seen. I spent 6 months on that story. I thought it might just be a theory. It still can be," he said, leaning forward. "Unless you want it to be more." Rowan narrowed her eyes. "Why contact me now? Because I'm done hiding. And because I want to decide how the story ends." They spoke for over an hour. He didn't give her everything. Some parts of his history were too dangerous to uncover fully, but he confirmed the core of her article. He explained why he left the empire behind, how he began this second life, and what he had been doing in the shadows. He didn't ask for protection. He didn't threaten. He simply told the truth, and when he was done, he said one thing that stayed with her: "You've written about corruption. About greed and power. You know what happens when men chase legacy instead of meaning. I don't need a legacy. I just want to leave a clean ripple in a dirty ocean. Publish if you want, just don't make me a myth." She said she'd think about it, and he trusted her. In the days that followed, he kept driving. Clients came and went, unaware that they were stepping into the car of a man whose name would soon re-enter the public consciousness. Some of them even discussed the article. One man laughed and said it sounded like the plot of a thriller. Another speculated that it was probably a foreign government laundering money through tech fronts. The billionaire listened and said nothing, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't just about being seen. It was about being understood. And for that to happen, he had to tell the story in his own words. He reached out to a former editor from his early investment days, an old friend who had long believed he was dead or disappeared. He sent a letter, handwritten, with no return address, asking only for a meeting. They met in a quiet park in Brooklyn. No fanfare, just two men on a bench sipping coffee and watching the city drift by. The editor didn't ask many questions, he just listened. "You look lighter than I remember," the editor finally said. "Maybe I am," he replied. "I've been carrying the wrong weight most of my life." He asked the editor to help him write a letter. Not a memoir, not a manifesto, just a letter to the world. A message that would be published after Rowan's story, offering clarity without ego, truth without spectacle. He wanted it to be anonymous, even as people guessed who it was. The editor agreed. Weeks passed. Then Rowan's article was updated. A second part, more direct. It outlined the truth, but with care. It described the man she had spoken to as someone trying to redesign influence, to redistribute trust, to build a quieter power rooted in responsibility rather than dominance. She included portions of his words. And then, as promised, the letter followed. It spread like fire. People didn't believe it at first. Some called it fiction. Others tried to unmask him. A few thought it was a performance art piece or a marketing stunt, but those who read closely knew. They recognized the sincerity, the detail, the humility. The former business world buzzed with rumors. Some guessed his identity accurately, others missed by miles. But what mattered wasn't his name, it was his message. He didn't stop driving even after the article went viral. He kept his job. Nia didn't say a word about it, though her look said everything. She knew now. She probably had for a while. One night after shift, she handed him a small envelope. "What's this?" he asked. "A job offer," she said, grinning. "For me." He opened it. Inside was a proposal, her idea for a new kind of transportation company, one that provided safe, dignified, fairly paid work for drivers and prioritized low-income passengers. A hybrid between private service and social infrastructure. She didn't ask for money. She asked for help building it right. He nodded. "You're going to be the face?" she asked. "No," he said. "You are," and that was how it started. A new venture, quiet, grounded, honest, not an empire, but a movement. He helped her from the shadows, strategy, legal structure, funding, but never stepped into the spotlight. He didn't want to. He had become something else now. Not a mogul, not a ghost, just a man who drove through the city and listened. A man who had made peace with anonymity, not as a disguise, but as a choice, years past. The letter remained archived, shared in classrooms and startup incubators and late-night forums about ethics and capitalism. His name never resurfaced formally, but his influence moved like wind felt, not seen. Eventually, he stopped driving. His body began to slow and the roads felt heavier. He passed the keys to someone younger, someone curious. He trained new drivers, mentored young entrepreneurs, offered guidance when asked, and disappeared when not needed. He moved to a small town upstate where he walked daily and spoke to no one unless spoken to. Some of the townspeople thought he was just a retired cabbie. Others suspected more. He never confirmed. He had nothing to prove in the end. His story was never about the disguise. It was about the freedom that comes when no one is looking. It was about reclaiming life, not through wealth or control, but through simplicity, through listening, through disappearing just enough to remember what it feels like to see. And so the billionaire who pretended to be a driver left the world not as a tycoon, not as a legend, but as something rarer. A man who chose to understand the world before trying to change it. A man who chose to be forgotten so that what he built would not be.